She had never been defeated. Not by beast. Not by man. Not until today. In the burning deserts of Suresh, where even the wind carries the memory of blood, a sapphire-skinned warrior named Nyara guarded her clan's sacred spring with unshakable pride. But when a stranger appeared, silent, unarmed, and far too calm, everything changed. His sword met her spear in midair. One strike, one moment, and silence Fong, her weapon, her honor, was broken. But that wasn't the end. It was the beginning, because the man who shattered her blade might be the only one who can help her save everything she loves. This is the story of war and rebellion, of a love forged in fire, of a woman who lost her weapon and found something far more dangerous. Welcome to Alien Whispers. If you enjoy cinematic sci-fi love stories with heart, fire, and unforgettable characters, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Let's dive in. The twin suns of Suresh hung low on the horizon, painting the jagged ridgelines in molten gold and crimson fire. Wind moved across the scorched earth in heated sighs, shifting fine particles of red dust into whispered spirals. Suresh did not welcome life. It tolerated it with an indifference bordering on cruelty. Nyara moved through this world like she had been carved from its very bones. Her sapphire-blue skin shimmered under the harsh sunlight, bearing faded scars and silver patterns down her arms, etched memories of battles survived and monsters slain. Her hair, long and braided with metal rings, swung behind her like a whip as she navigated the outcroppings. In her right hand, she held Silence Fong, a spear forged in a meteor's heart and cooled in the blood of her first kill. The shaft was wrapped in leather faded to gray from years of use, the blade gleaming with an almost eerie luminance. Her bare shoulders flexed with each careful movement as she descended the slope toward the ancient spring known as Akar's Rest. The spring was sacred, claimed by her clan for generations, and protected with blood. To find a stranger, an off-worlder, kneeling at its edge, cupping water in his hands, was a provocation Nyara could not ignore. Her sharp eyes narrowed. He wasn't armored. Dusty brown clothes clung to a lean, muscular frame. A long steel blade rested across his back, its hilt protruding just over his right shoulder. His hair was dark and tousled, tied back hastily. He looked like a traveler, maybe a soldier once, but there was something still about him, unshakable, and far too calm for someone moments away from death. Nyara dropped into a low stance atop a sandstone ledge and, with no warning, launched herself into the air. The world slowed. Her body twisted with predatory grace, spear leveled toward the stranger's back. He should have died before he even realized danger had come. But he turned, not startled, expectant. With terrifying precision, he drew the sword from his back and met her spear midair. Steel screamed against alloy. The impact rippled across the rocks, sending flocks of dune birds scattering. Sand exploded beneath their feet as Nyara landed, spinning to strike again. Her attacks came in fluid succession. Stab, sweep, feint, upward thrust, but the man blocked each one effortlessly. His movements were minimal, economic. Not a brawler. A tactician. Their weapons locked again. "You're fast," he said. His voice was calm, low, and tinged with an accent she didn't recognize. "And you're my territory. Didn't see your name on the water. Didn't need to." With a roar of effort, she broke the clash and spun low, the butt of her spear aiming for his knee. He pivoted, countering, and in one terrible instant, his sword came down. Crack! The spear split in two. One half clattered to the rocks. The other remained in her hand. She stumbled back, breathing hard, heart hammering. Not from fear, but fury. He hadn't just offended himself. He defeated her. That hadn't happened in years. The stranger stood, sword lowered, not gloating, just watching. Nyara's chest rose and fell, exposed skin glistening with sweat. She clutched the broken weapon like it might somehow hold her dignity together. "Go ahead," she growled. "End it." But he didn't. Instead, he slowly sheathed his sword. "I didn't come here to fight you." "Then why are you here?" "To understand this place. To find answers." Nyara blinked, caught off guard by his sincerity and the way his eyes didn't drift over her body the way most men's did. They held her gaze. Measure her like a question, not a possession. "What's your name?" she asked. "Dana. Dana Riker." She nodded slowly. "You broke silence, Fawn. I'll help you fix it. I don't want your help. I didn't ask for your permission." For a moment, they stood in silence, the dry wind tugging at their hair and clothes. Dane stepped closer, not threatening but sure. Nyara didn't move, though her grip on her half-spear tightened. He raised a hand, slow and deliberate. His fingers brushed her wrist, trailing lightly up her forearm, touching with the old scar lines etched in silver. Her breath caught. His hand paused there, not groping, not claiming, just feeling the shape of her past. "You survive a lot," he said. She pulled away, heart pounding, not from fear, from a fire blooming somewhere low in her belly. "I'll take you to the elders," she said. "They'll decide what to do with you. I thought you were the one in charge." "I was until 5 minutes ago." Nyara turned sharply, her back straight, hips swaying with controlled fury as she strode toward the cliffs. Dane followed. Behind them, the broken halves of Silence Fong lay like the carcass of a legend. But legends, like weapons, could be reforged, and sometimes stronger than before. They reached the outer ridge as the second sun dipped below the horizon. The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of scorched stone and faint traces of flowering dune thistle. Nestled between 3 jagged cliffs was Nyara's home, Virulent Hollow. No one greeted them. The village was quiet, too quiet. Children normally trained in the central ring were gone. The blacksmith's forge, usually glowing late into the evening, sat cold and silent. Nyara's boots struck the stone path like drumbeats, each step tightening the knot in her stomach. When they passed under the bone-arched entryway to the elder's circle, eyes finally appeared, watching from behind cloth-shaded windows, from doorways, from above. But none came forward. Dane's hand drifted near the hilt of his blade. "Something's wrong," he murmured. "I know." A tall figure emerged from a hut, a male with a weathered face and deep crimson markings across his forehead. "Trainik," Nyara called, relief flickering in her voice. "Where is Elder Rava? What's happened?" Trennick's eyes moved between her and Dane, resting longer on the human. "You should speak with the circle. Alone." "I don't take orders from gatekeepers," Dane said coolly. "You do now," Nyara snapped, then softened. "Just wait. Let me find answers." She handed him the broken spear shaft. Their fingers brushed. Dane held her gaze, nodded once, and leaned against the stone wall beside the elder's circle. Inside, the chamber smelled of ancient smoke and memory. Elder Rava sat at the center, her eyes half-lidded but far from blind. She was surrounded by 3 others. 1 Nyara recognized, 2 she didn't. "You've returned," Rava said, "and brought the one who broke your weapon. You know, we see more than you think." Nyara stepped forward. "Why is the village silent? Why are the warriors not preparing? Our territory has been breached." Rava's gaze didn't waver. "Because the territory no longer belongs to us." The word struck like frost. "What?" "The writ of transfer was signed this morning. Virulent Hollow is no longer sovereign. Lord Varkle owns the land. You sold our history. We preserved our people. You preserved your fear," Nyara hissed. Rava looked older than she ever had. "Leave this rage behind, child." "I'm no child." Nyara unslung the half-spear from her back and slammed it into the floor. "And I will not kneel to a man who buys loyalty with ink." From the doorway, Dane's voice rang. He didn't buy it. He took it, by falsifying planetary records and executing anyone who resisted. All heads turned. "You shouldn't be here," Trainik growled. "I should," Dane said. "Because unlike you, I came here to fight." And then, quietly, he met Nyara's eyes. "If you still want to." Later that night, silence ruled the hollow. Dane sat outside one of the abandoned training huts, eyes scanning the rocky cliffs where watchers once stood guard. Now they stood empty. Nyara joined him without a word. Her presence was a storm held in check. "They would rather survive than be free," she said bitterly. "I've seen this before," Dane replied. You're not the first to be betrayed by your elders. You won't be the last. He offered her a water skin. She took it, fingers brushing his again. The contact lingered a second longer than necessary. Her gaze flicked to him in the firelight, sharp but unreadable. You said he forged documents. I did. Can you prove it? Dane nodded. I found fragments in the abandoned surveying camps, records, terrain scans. The land is sacred by galactic law. If we transmit that data to the right people. No one listens to the broken, she said softly. Dane turned to her. Then we'll make them listen. Nyara lowered her eyes. They were my people, my family. Then remind them what blood still means. Later, in the dim light of the hut, Nyara traced the broken shaft of her spear while Dane adjusted a transmitter salvage from his gear. Their shoulders brushed as they worked side by side, and for a breathless second, Nyara felt the warmth of his thigh press into hers. She didn't move. He leaned over, inspecting her repaired weapon, and his hand rested on her bare lower back as he reached across her. She tensed, not from discomfort, but from the heat it stirred deep in her belly. You're still angry, he murmured. I should be, then be angry. But don't be alone. Nyara turned to him slowly. Their faces were inches apart. Her lips parted, but instead of kissing, she turned away. We leave tonight. Dane nodded. Where to? To find those who haven't forgotten who we are. She stood, her silhouette framed in the doorway by twin moons. Dane watched her go, pulse still racing, not from fear, but from a certainty that something had just shifted between them, and that nothing would be the same again. The dawn came cold and windless, a rare silence blanketing the desert as Nyara and Dane slipped from the village under a sky still heavy with stars. No one tried to stop them. No one even looked. They walked without speaking for miles, following old hunting paths known only to Nyara. The terrain grew harsher, rockier, more treacherous, as the hollow disappeared behind them. Their first stop was a ruined communications tower, swallowed by sand and time. There, Dane set up a relay to transmit the data fragments he'd recovered, proof of Varkel's fraud. But without a proper uplink, the signal would never leave the atmosphere. We need a stronger rig, he muttered, frustration lining his voice. I know where to get one, Nyara replied, but it's not unguarded. They found the outpost 2 days later. Nestled in a canyon, half buried and forgotten, the structure was little more than a shell of metal and stone. Inside lived one of Nyara's former allies, Kalvek, a rogue tech scavenger who once forged battle maps for the clans. Kalvek was tall and sinewy, his skin a pale violet and tattooed with digital ink that shimmered when he moved. He welcomed them with caution, though his eyes lingered curiously on Dane. A human, Kalvek snorted. You're keeping strange company, Hunter. I don't keep him, Nyara replied dryly. He follows. Dane raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. When Kalvek heard their plan, he laughed, until Dane showed him the survey logs. This, Kalvek breathed. This is real. If we get this off-world. Nyara leaned forward. Can you help us? He hesitated, then nodded. I have an uplink drone, but I'll need parts. And those parts are held by the mercenaries Varkel left behind in the trading post near Rivenspine. Then we take it, Dane said. Kalvek's lips twisted. It's suicide. I've survived worse, Nyara muttered. They planned that night by firelight. Nyara traced the map Kalvek drew with the tip of her dagger. Dane sat beside her, knees brushing hers, and though neither commented on the closeness, both felt the pull. You shouldn't come, she said quietly. If they see you, they'll target you. That's not your call, he replied. And besides, you'd miss me. She smirked faintly. You're not wrong. She didn't look at him when she said it, but when he looked at her, the fire reflected in her eyes made his breath catch. The raid on the trading post was swift and brutal. Under the cover of a sandstorm, they struck. Nyara moved like lightning, her newly reforged spear, now tipped with repurposed alloy from Dane's survival knife, cutting through armor like flesh. Dane covered her with precision shots, every round a promise. When the dust settled, the mercenaries were unconscious or fleeing. Kalvek arrived shortly after, gathering the needed parts while Dane and Nyara secured the perimeter. Inside the post control room, Dane found Nyara leaning against the wall, her chest rising and falling from exertion. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded. "Haven't bled like this in a while." Dane stepped closer, his hand brushing her upper arm to check a shallow wound. His fingers lingered a moment too long, trailing along her warm skin. Nyara didn't stop him. "Wasn't planning to get used to you," she murmured. "But—" her eyes met his. "But you're becoming harder to forget." The room was quiet except for the hum of cooling systems. He stepped even closer, her back pressed lightly to the wall, her spear still in hand, but lowered. "I won't leave unless you tell me to," he said. She tilted her head slightly. "That's the problem. I don't want to." And then, at last, she leaned in. Their kiss was slow and quiet, like the settling of dust after battle. Dane's hands cupped her face, thumbs grazing along the delicate curve of her jaw. Her lips parted beneath his with a sigh that trembled through them both. When they pulled apart, neither spoke. Words would have shattered the moment. Outside, the sandstorm cleared, revealing stars glinting over the desert like silver sparks. They returned to the canyon with the parts. Calvek launched the drone just before sunrise. "It'll reach orbit in under 3 hours," he said. "If someone's listening, they'll know the truth by nightfall." Nyara stood at the canyon edge, looking to the east. Dane approached. "We did it." She turned to him. "No, we started it." Behind them, Calvek smirked. "You've made enemies of powerful men." Dane placed a hand gently on Nyara's lower back. "Then we'll need powerful friends." She nodded once, her expression resolute. "Then it's time to find them." The drone had barely disappeared beyond the horizon when retaliation came. By mid-morning, 3 blackened troop crawlers surged across the desert toward Calvek's canyon outpost. Their hulls were marked with Varkel's sigil, a crimson gauntlet wrapped around a blazing sun. "Guess someone was listening," Calvek muttered, scanning the distance with a cracked scope. Nyara stood on the ledge above their hideout, the wind tugging at her braid. She said nothing, but her stance shifted, spine straighter, weight balanced. A predator at the edge of release. Dane loaded a fresh magazine into his rifle and stepped beside her. "They're coming fast." She didn't look at him. "Then we hit them faster." Calvek's hideout was defensible but not built for siege. They had limited ammo, no heavy ordnance, and no backup. But what they lacked in numbers, they made up for in precision and anger. The first wave came hard, armored mercs with energy rifles and suppressor drones. But Nyara was faster. She moved through them like a living storm, her spear now fused with Dane's alloy humming with every strike. Dane covered her flanks, picking targets with surgical efficiency. Their coordination was wordless, a dance they hadn't learned but somehow remembered. When she ducked, he fired over her shoulder. When he reloaded, she leapt into the breach. At one point, a mercenary nearly landed a fatal strike on Dane, but Nyara was there, knocking the blade aside and drawing blood with the turn of her elbow. The two locked eyes in the chaos, silent thanks. But it wasn't enough. Calvek was hit during the second wave, shoulder wound, deep but survivable. They retreated into the tunnels. "Fallback option?" Dane asked, dragging a crate to barricade the corridor. Calvek nodded, gritting his teeth. "There's an old supply shaft behind the med bay. Leads into the cliffs." They used it. The shaft was narrow and reeked of stale heat and ancient dust. Dane went first, hunched low, guiding Calvek through with careful grips under the arm. Nyara followed last, watching their backs, her spear gripped tight despite the claustrophobia pressing in around them. The only sound was their breath and the distant hum of drone thrusters. Nyara's shoulder brushed against the stone wall, and flakes of rock dust fell into her braid. In the faint red light of Calvek's portable scanner, her expression was carved from stone. "We're almost through," Dane said softly. His voice echoed oddly in the tunnel's confines. Calvek groaned behind him. "I hate tunnels. Too many things I can't see." "You've got us," Nyara replied. "We see enough." They emerged hours later through a crumbling ventilation grate into a rocky alcove overlooking the canyon. The sight of the open sky made Calvek sag with relief. Their new encampment wasn't much, just a sheltered overhang and a makeshift water collector, but it was defensible and hidden. Calvek spent the night recalibrating the broken transmitter, his hands steady despite the pain in his shoulder. Dane took first watch while Nyara slept, but he found himself glancing over to her often, watching the way her brow furrowed, even in dreams. In the pale moonlight, she didn't look like a warrior. She looked human. He didn't realize he'd drifted off until she stirred and sat up, stretching with a groan. "You should sleep," she said. "I'll take over. I was just watching the stars." Nyara gave him a long look. "We don't get to do that often, do we?" He shook his head. "Not when they're watching us back." The next day brought training. Dane began with the strongest refugees, former miners and hunters, putting them through basic drills, stance, breathing, timing. He was patient but unrelenting. He showed them how to fire with accuracy, how to move low and silent, how to survive. Nyara, meanwhile, focused on the others, the quiet ones, the children, the ones too scared to lift a weapon. She taught them how to listen to the wind, how to hide their tracks, how to send silent signals across open dunes. She crouched beside a girl no older than 10, placing the child's fingers on a bone whistle carved from Sandbeast fawn. "Sound is life," she whispered. "One note means danger. 2 means run." The girl nodded. That night, around the fire, Calvek told stories. He spoke of the old days, when the clans ruled their own territories and the stars were still something to reach for. His voice cracked, but the spark never dimmed. Even Dane found himself leaning closer. "I believed in peace once," Calvek said. "Thought knowledge could save us. Thought law would protect us." Nyara's eyes flicked to Dane. "What changed?" Dane asked. Calvek stared into the fire. "The law ran. The people didn't. That's why I'm here." It was near midnight when Dane found Nyara standing on a cliff edge, arms crossed, watching the stars. "You never sleep long," he said. She shook her head. "My dreams wake me before the dawn." He stepped closer. "What do you see out there?" "A battlefield. Or maybe a home. Depends on whether we win." He reached for her hand, not forcefully, just offering. She took it. Together, they stood in the silence, the stars glittering above them like ancient eyes. The wind rose softly, swirling sand around their feet in lazy arcs. In the distance, lightning flickered behind the dunes, silent but ominous. War was coming, and this time they would meet it with fire in their hearts and an army at their backs. The sun crept over the ridge like a slow blade, casting a crimson sheen across the dunes. Beneath the newly risen light, dozens of makeshift weapons gleamed, rifles rebuilt from mining tools, spears tipped with scrap alloy, and blades carved from the bones of fallen beasts. This was not an army. Not yet. But it would be. Nyara stood atop a sandstone outcrop, her figure backlit by the fire-orange sky. Below, the fighters she and Dane had trained for days waited in tense silence. Their eyes were wary, but sharp, focused. Dane approached her side. He carried his rifle across his back and a detonator in his hand. "Scouts confirm. The fuel convoy leaves in an hour. No heavy escort. Only 2 armored units." Nyara nodded, her expression unreadable. "Still enough to kill us if we're sloppy. That's why we won't be." He waited, but she didn't move. "You're thinking about what this means," he said quietly. She glanced down at the small force. "The moment we strike, we're not rebels anymore." "No," Dane replied. "We're a threat." A gust of wind swept through the canyon below, carrying the scent of sand and rust, and something more. Anticipation. The plan was simple, desperate, dangerous. The convoy, consisting of 3 transport haulers and 2 Sarthi scout tanks, would pass through the natural choke point known as Ashglaw Ravine. Narrow, rocky, perfect for an ambush. Dane split the force into 3 teams. Calvek led the engineers and gunners, positioned with makeshift explosives salvaged from broken mining gear. Nyara led the strike team up high, prepared to leap into close combat once the front was breached. Dane himself took a 3rd group, riflemen trained in hit-and-run tactics, ready to draw fire and isolate the Sarthi. They set the trap in silence. As the convoy rolled into the ravine, engines snarling, heat shimmered over their hulls. The Sarthi, green-skinned, armor-plated enforcers, stood alert on the lead tank. Calvek's voice cracked over the comm. "Stand by." Nyara crouched beside Dane on the cliffside, her breath steady, her eyes fixed on the point of no return. "Now," Dane whispered. A flash of fire erupted below. The front hauler exploded in a shower of metal and oil, flames curling into the sky like serpents. Before the Sarthi could react, Calvek's second charge detonated beneath the rear vehicle, boxing them in. "Go!" Nyara shouted. She vaulted from the ridge, spear in hand. Her warriors followed, roaring into the fray like a sandstorm with teeth. The first clash was brutal. Nyara struck with feral grace, her spear cleaving through a Sarthi's side. Dane took down 2 soldiers with well-placed shots before ducking into cover. Explosions rocked the canyon walls. Sand and fire danced together, blinding and beautiful. One Sarthi lunged at Nyara with a shock baton. She sidestepped and countered, driving her blade deep into his neck. Blood sprayed across her chest, steaming in the desert air. "Keep pushing," she yelled, eyes wild. Dane coordinated his flank through short commands and sharp fire bursts. He moved like he'd been born to war, not with fury, but precision. Every bullet counted, every step calculated. As the battle raged, Calvek's team disabled the rear tank's main turret, sending it crashing sideways into the rocks. With the vehicles neutralized and most of the Sarthi down, the final fight turned savage. Blades met armor, fists met bone. And then, silence. The canyon settled into stillness. Ashes drifted through the air like black snow. They'd won, but Nyara didn't celebrate. Not yet. She stood among the wreckage, panting, her skin slick with sweat and blood. Her spear dripped green Sarthi ichor. All around her, fighters staggered, dazed but alive. Then came the moment. Dane handed her the flare. She looked at it, then at the burning husk of the fuel hauler. "This is it," she said. "Once we light this, there's no turning back." "No," Dane said, stepping closer. "But they'll know. Every outpost, every coward hiding behind Varkel's walls. They'll know someone struck back." Nyara lit the flare. She turned and hurled it into the largest hauler. The fuel ignited with a roar that shook the cliffs. A towering inferno erupted into the dawn sky, fire consuming steel and sand alike. The smoke curled into a distinct spiral, visible for miles. A message in flame. Hours later, under the shade of a broken transport wing, Dane found Nyara sitting alone. "You should rest," he said. "I will. You didn't lose anyone today." "I know, but you still feel it." She looked up at him. Her eyes weren't hard this time, just tired. "Today, we struck first," she murmured. "But it won't be the last." He knelt beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "You did what no one else dared. You lit the fire." Nyara didn't answer, but she leaned into his touch. There was blood on her collarbone. He reached to wipe it gently with a cloth, his fingers warm against her skin. Her breath hitched, but she didn't pull away. Their eyes met. This time, when he leaned in, she didn't stop him. Their lips met with quiet urgency, no longer hesitant, no longer uncertain. It wasn't passion that drove them. It was clarity, purpose. The flame they'd kindled now burned between them. When they parted, the sky above them was streaked with black smoke and gold light. The war had begun, but they had each other, and the fire would not die. By noon, the fire at Ashglore Ravine had spread a message across half the continent. And by nightfall, the response came. They heard the hum first, dull, mechanical, bone-deep. Then came the lights, for sleek aerial dropships descending from orbit like vultures to a carcass. From the canyon outpost, Calvek watched with his scope. "That's not a patrol. That's retaliation. They're coming fast," Dane said. "Faster than expected." Nyara stood in the center of the camp, surrounded by warriors and civilians alike. The smoke of victory had barely cleared, and now, war descended with teeth bared. "We have less than an hour," she said. "Pack everything. Weapons, food, water. We move." Calvek limped toward her. "We won't outrun them." "We don't have to outrun. We have to scatter. Give them nothing." They split the camp into 3 groups. Nyara led the strongest through the Black Spire cleft. a narrow gorge only she knew how to navigate. Dane and Calvek took the wounded along the dried riverbed toward the western ridges. The third group, made of elders and children, was hidden in a collapsed mining shaft marked to look unstable. They didn't have enough weapons, not enough food, but they had hope and grit. Dane helped carry a wounded boy, no older than 10, whose leg had been scorched in the blast. Nyara kissed the child's forehead before parting, whispering something only he could hear. The boy clung to Dane like a lifeline. "Will we make it?" the boy asked. Dane lied. "Of course." The first explosion came just before sundown. Distant but heavy. Calvek cursed, checking his scope. They found the ridge group. "It's not going well." Dane clenched his jaw. "How many do we send that way?" 18. Mostly wounded. Dane didn't answer, just kept walking. Calvek limped after him. "We should have stayed and fought." "We would have died," Dane said. "You say that like it's worse than this." Nyara's group reached the canyon wall by nightfall. They were covered in dust and blood, exhausted but intact. From her vantage point, she saw the fires burning in the west. She didn't speak, but she lowered her head. Behind her, one of the scouts, a young woman named Tyan, approached. "They burned the shaft," she whispered. "We saw it from the ridge." Nyara turned slowly. "Children." Tyan's silence was enough. For the first time, Nyara staggered. She dropped to one knee, gripping the sand as if it might stop her from unraveling. She whispered, they were just trying to survive. Tyan knelt beside her, eyes brimming. "This isn't on you." Nyara looked up, her face hollow. "It is." I lit the fire. The next morning, Nyara and Dane reunited at a rocky hollow east of the old relay spires. Their people, what remained, were quiet, eyes sunken, bodies bruised. 17 dead, Calvek reported. 9 missing. "We lost a quarter of our strength in less than 2 days. Nyara stared into the sand. "We need shelter, water, food. They'll keep hunting us." "We can't run forever," Dane said. "Eventually we fight, or we fall." "I know." She turned away from the camp, stepping out into the open. Her voice was soft but full of iron. "I need air." Dane followed. They stood beneath a weather-worn rock arch, watching the heat rise off the land. "She's breaking," Calvek had said earlier. But Dane didn't see that. He saw someone holding herself together so tightly, so perfectly, she might shatter from a whisper. "I thought I knew pain," she said. "Losing territory, being exiled, watching my clan surrender. But this..." He didn't interrupt. "This is what rage does, Dane. It burns indiscriminately. And I fed it. I fed all of them." "You fed them hope," he replied. Nyara looked at him. "Hope got children burned alive." He stepped closer. "No, Varkle did that. You gave them something to stand for. That matters." She stared at him. "Then help me make it matter more." They returned to camp with a new resolve. Dane called for all remaining fighters. Calvek powered up the ancient relay spire with a hack solar cell. And Nyara, for the first time, addressed them not as a warrior, but as a leader. "We lost more than lives yesterday," she said. "We lost illusions. That there is a safe place in this world. That if we hide long enough, they'll stop looking." She walked the circle, her voice growing with every step. "But that's a lie. We are already marked, already hunted. So if we're going to bleed, let's bleed with our blades in hand. Let's remind them that fire, once lit, spreads." She paused beside Dane, then drew her spear and plunged it into the sand. "This is not surrender. This is not fear. This is our line. And we hold it." The crowd was silent for a breath, then a whisper, then a roar. Later that night, while the survivors prepared, Calvek pulled Dane aside. "I think we have a leak," he said. Dane stiffened. "What do you mean?" "Someone told them where we'd run. How else would they find the shaft so fast?" Dane's eyes darkened. "You have a name?" Dane's eyes darkened. "You have a name?" Calvek hesitated. "Tyan." She was the last to scout near the ridge. Dane didn't want to believe it. But he learned long ago, war made spies of the desperate. That night, Dane found Nyara alone by the ridge, sharpening her spear with steady, deliberate strokes. He told her. She didn't flinch, but her hand slowed. "She fought beside me," she said quietly. "She saved my life at the ravine. She might have been told to, Dane replied. They said nothing for a while. Then Yarrow whispered, Tomorrow, we confront her. But not tonight. Why wait? She glanced at him. Because if I do it tonight, I might not ask questions first. Dane didn't argue. Instead, he sat beside her, silent in the dark, the stars above them cold and watching.